My name is Joanne Hunter. Today's presentation has been organized by the Nature-Based Solutions Interest Group. With nature at the heart of climate solutions, I would like to share a couple of announcements. World Wildlife Day will be celebrated on March 3rd, tomorrow, under the theme Recovering Key Species for Ecosystem Restoration. The celebrations will seek to draw attention to the conservation status of some of the most critically endangered species of wildlife and fauna, and to drive discussions towards implementing solutions to conserve them. On Monday, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released part 2 of the 6th assessment report entitled Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability. Nature-based solutions are defined as actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. The IPCC report warns that even small increases in global warming will have significant impacts on nature and on people. In every region of the world, we will see ecosystem destruction and biodiversity loss, as well as significant risk of species extinction. Evidence suggests that maintaining the resilience of biodiversity and ecosystem services depends on effective and equitable conservation of approximately 30 to 50% of Earth's land, freshwater, and ocean areas. In the press release for the IPCC report, Inger Andersen, Executive Director of the UN Environmental Program, stated that the best way to soften the blow of climate change is to let nature do the job it has taken millions of years to perfect. To name a few examples, absorbing and channeling rainwater and surging waves, maintaining biodiversity and the health of soils so that diverse plants can grow, and providing shade under leafy canopies to heat-baked cities. Anderson urges that we need wide-scale ecosystem restoration from oceans to mountains. Along with decreasing GHG emissions, conserving nature is the best solution to adapt and slow climate change. Nature can provide many services to counteract the impacts of climate change, but only if we save it first. And now I would like to introduce you to our guest speaker, Dr. Julia Baum. Dr. Baum is President's Chair, Provost Engaged Scholar, and Professor of Ocean Ecology and Global Change at the University of Victoria, British Columbia. Her research focuses on ecology and conservation of marine environments, investigating how disruptions such as climate change are altering those ecosystems and if or how they'll recover. Since 2009, Dr. Baum has done hundreds of dives in the coral reefs of Christmas Island, off Christmas Island, 2,000 kilometers south of Honolulu. She studied the impact of the worst global coral bleaching episode in recorded history. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Baum, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. Okay, so thanks so much for the invitation to speak today. It's a real pleasure to be able to share with you some of my story and understanding of coral reefs in the ocean and what we can do about climate change. And I'm actually from Southern Ontario. I grew up in Guelph, so it's nice to be speaking to a Southern Ontario audience. But today I'm actually speaking to you from Victoria, British Columbia on the West Coast. And I want to begin by acknowledging with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory I have the privilege of working in and living in, as well as the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich people. And the Wasanich people are actually, that name means the saltwater people or ocean people. And all of these people, historical relationships with the lands and the waters continues to this day. So I'm going to take you on a journey to a coral reef, but we're going to start with a few other things. So I want to start by giving an overview of the climate emergency, and then talk about the importance of the oceans to climate change. And then we'll talk about my journey on coral reefs, and that might end up being a bit of emotional roller coaster. So you may end up being a bit down at the end of that coral reef story. And so I want to finish by bringing you back up, and we'll talk about climate change solutions and what Canadians like yourselves and myself can do to save coral reefs and save ourselves and the planet. So what you're seeing before you is this very stunning coral reef image, is an image that my team took on Christmas Island. As Joanne said, we work on Christmas Island. There's two Christmas Islands. One is famous for the red crabs, and it is off the west coast of Australia and in the Indian Ocean, and that is not the one that we work on. I always have to tell people that because they're always zooming in mentally on that one. So as Joanne said, we work on Christmas Island, that is part of the Republic of Kiribati. This is an island nation in the central equatorial Pacific, and the island of Christmas, where we work, is due south of Honolulu, just to orient you. So this is one of the reefs on Christmas Island, and we will come back to that a little bit later in the presentation. So first, I want to acknowledge that I have a wonderful team of graduate students and postdoctoral fellows and undergraduate students at the University of Victoria that have helped make all of the work that I'm going to tell you about today possible. And this is how we've met for most of the past 2 years. But we did have the opportunity to, during the brief window when we were allowed to meet in person, to have one of our laboratories out on the west coast of the West Coast at Baum Marine Science Center. So this is us last Labor Day weekend out there. So diving right into the climate change story, we, as you all know, are in this period of rapid planetary change that is unprecedented in the past several millennia. And this figure that you're seeing here is from the most recent IPCC assessment report. This is from the Working Group 1's report. So the first working group focuses on the physical changes, so how climate change is actually happening, and that one was released last September. And this figure is showing temperature on the y-axis and a span of time beginning in 1850, which is around the time that we start having really good temperature records and started to see climate change. And this goes all the way up to 2020. And 2 points that I want to make with this figure. First of all, the black line, you can see this unambiguous warming. And the black line is the observed increase in temperature that has been seen since 1850. And so we have actually warmed, as of last year, we have now reached warming of 1.2 degrees Celsius above background levels. And the other thing that's really important about this particular figure and what the latest IPCC report was able to show is to separate the warming that we would have expected, or the temperature change that we would have expected, without human-induced climate change. And that's this greenish line that you see here. So you can see we would have been bumping along. Of course, there's some natural variability, but without human-caused climate change through greenhouse gas emissions, we would not be in this period of warming. And that's one of the things that over the years the IPCC has been able to do better and better, is to attribute the changes that we see on planet Earth to human-induced warming. So another way of depicting this warming period that we're in is with these stripes, which have become known as the warming stripes. And these were created by British climate scientist Ed Hawkins. And this is the latest iteration of them. So he's been updating them each year. And what you're seeing here, if you haven't seen these before, each vertical line is 1 year in time, going from 1850 on the left all the way up to 2021 on the right. And it's showing you the annual global temperature for that particular year, depicted as blues being cooler and reds being warmer relative to a baseline period between 1971 and 2000. So I was born here in the mid 70s, and in this period where we were still relatively cool compared to what was about to come. And if you were born in 1950 or around that time, that's where you started experiencing these temperatures. But most of the students that I teach were born over here, maybe 20, 21 years ago, in this period where we were already warming. And so I always point out to them that they actually have no baseline. They don't know what normal is. And what you can see from this figure is that warming has continued to increase and is getting worse and worse each year. Now, we have some really important choices to make about how much warming we will experience in the coming decades, and that directly depends on our ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so what you're seeing here are the projected near-term changes in the next couple of decades. And a few things to point out here. First of all, it is a virtual certainty at this point that we will reach 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. That is absolutely going to happen. There's no way to prevent that at this point, and it will happen sometime in the next couple of decades. But we have a lot of choices to make about what happens after that. And those choices depend, again, on the number of greenhouse gas emissions that are released, and so our ability to curb those emissions. And even in the previous IPCC report back in 2014, they were still making projections and thinking about projections out to 4 degrees Celsius, and their worst projection was out to about 8 degrees Celsius. And 1.5 degrees Celsius wasn't really even on the table at that point. And so that's one of the big things that has shifted over the past decade, is this understanding that even warming of 2 degrees Celsius will be catastrophic, and that it's going to be bad enough at 1.5, and we really, really, really need to be ensuring that after we hit 1.5, we start tailing off and curbing that so we don't go much beyond that. So this is simply another way of depicting those potential futures for ourselves and our children, grandchildren. This on the left is essentially the warming over all of the land and ocean that would be expected if we limit things to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this is sort of I think of it as the act fast. We need to get our act together right now and act very fast to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And on the right is the scenario where we continue sort of with a business as usual framework, which could actually even be worse than this if we don't start reining things in. So this image and these types of images are ones that the IPCC and climate scientists have used for a long time to illustrate the magnitude and how important climate change is, and to attempt to get people to respond and react. But in fact, I've always found it hard to digest these types of figures, because I think when we are talking about changes that might not happen until the end of this century or decades from now, it's difficult to digest and really feel the urgency. And so one of the things that happened to me was this climate emergency, that extreme weather event that happened on coral reefs. And that for me brought climate change home in a very immediate way. And what we've seen in Canada, and indeed all around the world over the past couple of years, is a huge increase in extreme weather events that are really driving home for us the fact that the climate emergency is already happening. And so just to make the point that for a long time, when we talked about global warming and thought about climate change, we really thought about these long, slow, gradual changes that would happen. And what we all understand more and more is that alongside those gradual changes is a huge increase in extreme weather events of all types, and that those are the things that are really much more immediate and need our immediate attention. So to drive home this point, which I'm sure we're all aware of, increases in temperature have been, as you saw in the warming stripes, just accelerating. And most of the hottest years ever experienced on the planet, at least in the past couple of millennia, have been in the past 7 years. And so just to go back to 2020, 2020 was the joint hottest year ever recorded, tied with 2016. 2021 was the fifth hottest year, so not quite as bad as 2020, but we're still in this area of really huge and all-encompassing warming. The last 7 years were the hottest on record, and we're going to turn in a minute to the ocean. Last year was also the hottest year of temperatures ever experienced across the oceans. So warming is pervasive and increasing and more intense than it's been for a very long time. And these are global statistics that I'm showing you, but we're also feeling this in Canada, of course. So Canada is warming at twice the global rate. So we are really going to feel a lot of these impacts. We know that, again, extreme weather events are one of the ways that they are being felt. And for example, heat-related deaths in Canadians and seniors have increased enormously just in the past 20 years because of this increase in heat waves in our summers. Driving home for you in Toronto or the Toronto area, there was a recent global survey that looked at impacts of climate change in major urban centers, and 4 Canadian cities made that list, but Toronto topped that list as being the Canadian city that will experience the worst climate change impacts. Now, out here on the West Coast, we, of course, have been making headlines for all of the extreme weather events that we experienced over the past year, and it has definitely been a doozy of a 12 months to be out here. So last summer, we had the extreme heat dome that was pretty unbearable. I was here for it. And one of the things that definitely differs between Southern Ontario and Victoria is that most of us don't have air conditioning. Very few people have air conditioning. And so we were sitting in these buildings just sweltering with really little way to get relief from it. But we also know that in the end, a lot of people died in that heat wave. We know that the entire town of Lytton was completely destroyed in that heat wave. We know that these heat waves also cause devastating wildfires. And the types of wildfires that were raging last summer are predicted to become commonplace within the next few decades out here. We also had extraordinary rainfalls. We now have something called atmospheric rivers in our lexicon, which probably none of us knew what an atmospheric river was until very recently, but we now know that viscerally out here on the West Coast, at least. And the most frequent and costly climate change disaster across Canada is flooding. And so this underscores the need for much better adaptation to climate change in Canada. So just coming back to the IPCC report, this is that first working group's report that Joanne and I were referring to, the physical science basis. And when it was released last September, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called that report, August, sorry, not September, called that report a code red for humanity, and said that if we combine forces now, we can avert climate catastrophe. So between the release of that report and the release of Monday's report, of course, we had COP26 in Glasgow. So a lot of things have been happening on the international policy front. And then the release of this new report that Joanne already showed you, which focused specifically on climate change impacts and adaptation and vulnerability. And Antonio Guterres, in a pretty damning indictment, said that this new report is an atlas of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership. So really, really underscores how severe the crisis that we are in now is, that it definitely already is here. This is not something that we need to think about our grandchildren experiencing. We're experiencing now, and the need to act has never been greater. So I want to turn now to the ocean. I don't know, Joanne, if there's any questions at this point, or I would just move into talking about the role of the ocean. Oh, you're on
Sorry,
mute.
there's not too many questions yet, so why don't you go ahead?
Okay, great. Sure, great. Okay, so I want to talk about the role of the ocean. And growing up in Guelph, I didn't actually see the ocean until I was 10 years old on a family trip to PEI. So I know that the ocean can seem fairly distant when you're in Toronto. But we are actually an ocean nation. Canada has 3 oceans, and we have the world's longest coastline. So we are definitely an ocean nation, and we need to be thinking about the ocean, understanding how important the ocean is, and taking care of the ocean. And the ocean is so important to climate change that between that 2014 IPCC report and this most recent IPCC report, the IPCC put out this special report focused specifically on the ocean and the cryosphere. So that has to do with melting glaciers and ice sheets on these 2 facets because they are so fundamental to climate change. So why is the ocean so important for climate change? The ocean is one of the key regulators of climate. So even without climate change, the ocean is always regulating our climate. And specifically with respect to climate change, oceans absorb the vast majority, actually almost all of the heat that we have emitted. So it's estimated that the oceans have absorbed over 90%, 93 is the exact number, of the excess heat from greenhouse gas emissions since the 1970s. So without the oceans absorbing all of this heat, temperatures on land already would have risen to an extent that the planet would be uninhabitable for us. So I always like to think about that and give the oceans a little thanks each day for keeping our planet habitable thus far. But in absorbing all of that heat, the oceans are themselves warming up and also experiencing numerous other impacts as a result. So they're doing this extraordinary service for us, but we're also really placing them in peril as a result of that. The other factor is that the oceans are absorbing between 20 and 30% of the carbon dioxide that we're emitting. So they're also drawing that down. And that's a key factor in causing change pH of the ocean, and so causing ocean acidification. And so often when we think about climate change in the ocean, we think about what's called the twin evils, and that is ocean warming and ocean acidification. So the planets really are our heat sink. That's how I think of them. And in this report, this is the summary figure, and I understand that there's many different panels here, but I'm going to take you through them in much larger size so you can actually see a few of the details. But this was the key figure from that 2019 special report on the ocean from the IPCC. And the point that I want to make from this, and we'll take you through in a minute, is simply that climate change is altering a lot of different factors and components of our oceans. And so there are a lot of different things that are being impacted. So as I've said already, there are these very significant increases in temperature. And what you're seeing in this figure, and you'll see in the other ones, is these brown lines, which are showing the historic changes, so changes that have already been experienced, either in the brown or purple. And then you'll see these 2 divergent lines, which are 2 different projections of the road that we could take, depending on the extent to which we limit greenhouse gas emissions. So just to show you how ocean temperatures have increased since 1950, and I think this is a more easily digestible format, I'll just take you through this little video here. So 1960, 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, and 2010. So we're really warming up our oceans. And probably not surprising then, a result of that or something that's happening alongside that is the loss of huge ice sheets and glaciers. And so what you're seeing here is these different ice sheets. This is the Greenland ice sheet loss, Antarctic ice sheet loss, glacier mass loss. And all of this is leading to increases in sea level, so sea level rise. And sea level rise is, of course, going to really impact a lot of island nations in the Pacific, for example, but it is also going to have huge impacts on a lot of coastal cities. Most of the world's major cities, mega cities, are built on or near the coast, and a lot of those are really vulnerable to sea level rise, in particular New York City and Miami, probably closest to home for us. And then, as I said, ocean acidification is one of the other major changes. And so we've seen these decreases already in pH. And that has ramifications for a lot of ocean life. One of the major things that ocean acidification affects is any organism that needs to build a hard calcareous shell. So that includes corals, coral reefs. Corals are starting to not be able to grow at the same rates because of ocean acidification. Here in Canada, changes in ocean pH are impacting a lot of our invertebrates. So on the East Coast, for example, that's lobster. On the West Coast, we can think about, so there's our commercial fisheries for invertebrates. Anything that is a shellfish has a hard shell. And on the West Coast, that's primarily in our aquaculture industry. So oysters, for example, are really affected by ocean acidification. And then just to point out one of the other changes that we might not think about that much, we think about temperature, we think about pH, but all of this is combining to decrease the amount of oxygen that is available in the upper ocean level. And that really can have impacts on how marine life is able to withstand warming. So as oceans warm up, organisms need more and more oxygen, and at the same, because their metabolic rate increases, but at the same time there is less oxygen, and this kind of creates the perfect storm for a lot of our marine life. So just to show you this in one other way, this is from this special report, and this was the ocean changes and cryosphere changes. But if we just zoom in on the things that you can see inside this red box, these are the major ones that I've talked about so far. So this increase in ocean heat content, so that's the rising temperatures, ocean acidification, loss of ocean oxygen, increases in sea level rise, and then the other one, which is the one that I'm going to spend most of the rest of the talk speaking about, is marine heat waves. And so that's these increases in temperature that are extreme weather events. So short pulses of increased ocean temperature above what would be normally found in that area. And what we know from climate science is that marine heat waves are one of the best understood forms of climate change in the ocean. So we know with very, very high certainty that marine heat waves under climate change are becoming more frequent. They are lasting for a longer time on average, and they are becoming more intense. So the number of degrees Celsius above average with each heat wave is bigger than in the past. So in the past, they might have only been 1 degree Celsius above background temperatures. Maybe now they're 2 degrees or 3 degrees, so it's increasing all the time. And that increase in frequency of marine heat waves really means that marine ecosystems don't have sufficient time to recover often before the next marine heat wave hits. Okay, so coming back to coral reefs, I'm going to dive into a major marine heat wave that hit on Christmas Island, where I work. But I can also take questions if there are any now about oceans.
I think there's only one, Dr. Baum, and Michael Berger asks, could you talk a bit about growing food in the oceans in a sustainable manner?
Right, so aquaculture. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Yeah,
that's it.
so I think aquaculture has already taken off in recent decades, but there's even more interest now, I think, in increasing aquaculture and trying to ensure that it is done in a sustainable way. So I can, yeah, I guess there's a number. I'm not sure exactly what you're interested in knowing, but what I can say is, well, there's lots of problems with aquaculture. So we have a lot of challenges here on the West Coast with salmon aquaculture, for example, and it's highly contentious for, which you maybe are all aware of, because we exclusively farm Atlantic salmon out here on the West Coast, where we have five amazing species of Pacific salmon. We farm Atlantic salmon, and they cause all sorts of problems for our native salmon, which are already in trouble. So I'm not a big fan of salmon aquaculture. There's lots of aquaculture of lower trophic levels, so invertebrates, and I think that can be done in a sustainable way. So things like mussels and oysters are two that we like to eat, at least. So I think that can be done in a sustainable way, but one of the things that is potentially really damaging to them is ocean acidification. So we've already seen some of the farms out here experience periods where their shellfish get in trouble from ocean acidification, or also from the heat waves that have happened. Yeah, I'm not sure what else. I'm definitely not an aquaculture expert. I don't know if I can answer too much more, but I think there's great interest in expanding aquaculture, as well as doing it quite offshore as well. So there's a lot of interest in developing it. We'll see where it goes.
Could I just jump in? Sorry, I saw that Michael asked that question. Sorry, Karen, I think he was asking about vegetable growing in terms of aquaculture.
Oh, good. Okay. I didn't see that part. Good.
So things like, oh, sorry.
So vegetable growing, is there anything on that side?
So, right. So you're talking about things like kelp farming, like mariculture. There's a huge interest in kelp farming right now. I'm not sure if that's.
Yes, that's what I mean.
The question is working. Okay. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So, yes, kelp farming. Interest in kelp farming has exploded around the world, and it is huge out here right now on the West Coast. There are kelp farms all around Vancouver Island at this point, and they're starting to expand up the coast. So the major one here on the West Coast is Cascadia. They are based out of Bamfield on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and they have ambitious plans to expand up the whole coast, I know. There are also similar ventures happening in a lot of other countries, so a huge interest in kelp farming. And I think there's a number of reasons for that, but one of the reasons is the idea that kelp farming might be able to contribute to climate change mitigation by growing the kelp. One of the reasons for that is that the kelp species that are growing are amongst some of the fastest growing I want to say plants, but they're actually algae. So some of the fastest growing organisms on the planet. So bull kelp, for example, is growing inches per day and very rapidly growing meters. And so it can grow really quickly. And the idea is that by growing really quickly, if you can then bury some of that kelp, you can be drawing down carbon. I will say that there are a number of questions about whether or not that is actually going to work in any way, shape, or form. And my own perspective is that the science lags far behind the enthusiasm, and that I've seen a lot of enthusiasm for it. There were a lot of talks about it at COP26. I think a lot of these ventures are running away with the idea that kelp is going to save us from climate change, and I will say categorically that is completely not going to happen. But I think there could be other benefits for kelp. So it grows quickly. It can be incorporated into cattle feed, for example, and might reduce methane emissions from cattle. It can be used for lots of different types of food. So there are benefits from kelp, but I think there's also a huge sort of kelp bandwagon right now that we just need to be cautious about and not get too carried away with.
Thank you, Dr. Baum. There are a number of questions, but should we continue on at this point and keep them for the next break? Okay.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I want to dive into coral reefs. And coral reefs, although very distant from us in Canada, are extraordinarily important ecosystems. I hope that some of you have been to a coral reef, had the opportunity to either snorkel or dive on one. They're absolutely amazing. And they harbor a disproportionate amount of the ocean's biological diversity. So coral reefs cover only about 0.1% of all of the ocean's surface. So this very, very small fraction of the ocean's surface, and yet they harbor an estimated 0.25% of all marine life. They are also worth an extraordinary amount of money. It's estimated in the trillions annually when you combine all of the fisheries and tourism, especially, that coral reefs are responsible for, as well as shoreline protection from storms and other things like that. So they provide enormously important ecological goods and services to millions of people around the world. So there is a lot at risk here if we lose coral reefs. So the coral reef that I'm going to take you to today, as I said already, is Christmas Island. And you may have seen this word written before. This is how it is pronounced. So most people pronounce it Kiritimati. So you may have heard it referred to as that, but it is actually pronounced Charissimus. So, but I'll take either. So this is where the island is, as I said, due south of Honolulu. This is an aerial shot of the island. It is the world's largest atoll. It is 150 kilometers in perimeter, and I'm going to show you another view of that now. So this is our sort of more scientific map of the island, and what you're seeing there, all of those different circles, are simply all of the different parts of the island that we conduct monitoring on. So we've been monitoring underwater on the island since 2009 at 40 different sites. And one of the real attractions to working on Christmas Island initially was that it has this very strong gradient, spatial gradient of local human impacts. And that's because almost all of the people live up here on the northwest coast, where you see these underlying pink bubbles. That's the population. So those are a couple of the major villages. And so the coral reef sites near those villages have been virtually destroyed. So there's been an enormous amount of dredging, so physical damage, pollution going onto the reef. Those are the two big ones. Fishing as well, but I think that's a more minor component. And then as you fan out from those really heavily impacted reefs, the reefs become more and more pristine because they're facing less and less impacts. And these are some of the people on Christmas Island. As I said, people are the I-Gilbertese, or the I-Kiribati, they're part of the Republic of Kiribati, which was under British protectorate until 1979 and has been an independent country since then. This is one of the poorest countries in the world, and most people are really intimately connected to the reef. So they are living right beside the reef, and they are fishing for it either to feed themselves or their families or to trade it locally. So the reefs are fundamental to these people, and they're at risk of being lost for the reasons that I'm going to show you today, and as well as sea level rise. So a visual representation of this local disturbance gradient. This is one of the coral reefs right next to the villages on that northwest coast. And it's difficult to call this a coral reef at this point, but you can see maybe a couple of coral heads there in the image. And this is one of the reefs at the other end of the island. So just a stunning difference. And that was what attracted me to work on the island initially, because I wanted to understand how people alter coral reefs, and it's difficult to do that in most other places without going to many, many different islands. And it's also difficult to find a pristine reef like this one where there's actual access by air. So Christmas has one flight in and out a week. Most other islands that look like this, you need a research vessel to get to. So this ended up being this perfect study system. Okay, and that's just showing you where those really degraded reefs are and some of the pristine ones. And I'm going to show you a few photos of Christmas to give you a sense of what it's like there. We're, of course, spending most of our time underwater, but Christmas is also one of the Pacific Ocean's most important seabird colonies, and there are a number of sub-islets around the island that are protected for seabirds. This is one of the very typical boats on the island. Just looking out at sunset. And now I'm going to take you underwater to see what we are normally seeing. This is a very typical view on the reef with lots of fish. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So we started working there in 2009, and we've been doing ecological sampling underwater and also socioeconomic sampling. So interviewing hundreds of people in the different villages to understand about their fishing, where they're fishing, what they're fishing, and also about human welfare. So how they and their families are doing. This is just some views of some of our different underwater sampling that we've done over the years. And as I said, I was trying to understand how local pressures alter coral reefs. And so when I initially went to Christmas Island, I wasn't actually thinking about climate change. Oh, I'm just going to show you one more photo. This is the kids. So we always do some outreach activities with the kids in the local schools. And this is one where we were teaching them about the interconnectedness of life on the coral reef. So that's always, yeah, really fun activities to do. Okay, so as I said, when I started studying coral reefs, I wasn't thinking about climate change at all. I was thinking about fishing, and I've worked on fisheries for a long time, both in Canada and global analyses, and now on coral reefs. And that was really what I believed was the main way that people impact the ocean. And so I've had quite a wake-up call over the past decade. And for me, that wake-up call came initially in 2014 with the threat of an impending El Nino event, which is a natural climatic cycle in the Pacific Ocean that essentially reverses temperature and precipitation patterns around the world, and they can fluctuate really greatly in intensity. So the previous biggest El Nino had been in 97, 98. And scientists who study El Ninos had kind of been waiting and waiting and waiting for the next big one to learn more about them. And so because there have been so many extreme events lately caused by El Ninos and caused by other phenomena in the ocean, we now refer to these events generally as marine heat waves. But the particular one that I'm going to talk about was caused by a very large El Nino. And so I got a call in the spring of actually March 2014, so 8 years ago, from a climate scientist at Georgia Tech University, Kim Cobb, who has been studying El Ninos for decades and said the next big one is coming. And it's predicted that it's going to hit Christmas Island really, really hard, and we need to get out there. And so I'm going to tell you a story of we mobilized a team and what we saw. And so what you're seeing in this image right here, this red swath is essentially one of the measurements of an El Nino. So this is essentially an El Nino coming across from the west coast of South America and coming right across the Pacific Ocean, which is it's a very well-known trajectory for El Ninos. And this is Christmas Island here in this black circle. Okay, so why are marine heat waves so threatening to corals? It has to do with a very intimate relationship that I'm going to tell you about that corals have. So corals are animals, and they live in this tight partnership with microscopic algae, which you're seeing here. These algae used to be called, they've gone through lots of name changes. They used to be called zooxanthellae, then they were called Symbiodinium, and now they're called Symbiodinaceae, but I will probably just refer to them as symbionts for simplicity. So what you're seeing here are these algae under a microscope. And I just want to point out that under a microscope, they all look the same. But there are actually hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of these symbionts. And that actually becomes really important for climate change, as I'll show you. This is an individual coral polyp, just seen from the side. And there are hundreds of these polyps that form an individual coral colony. And what you're seeing here are 3 different coral polyps. And the red, so this is under a fluorescing microscope, the red are all of the symbiont cells, so the chlorophyll from all of the symbionts, and the blue and green are the coral. So these symbionts are packed really tightly inside every coral. And it's a nutritional symbiosis. So they are feeding the coral. These symbionts are photosynthetic, so they're photosynthesizing, drawing energy in, and then they're sharing it with the coral. And that is the main form of food source for corals. And so the coral, in turn, is providing a home for the symbionts. So that's this symbiotic relationship. But as I said, there's lots of different types of these symbionts, and they really range in terms of the quality of partnership. So some of them are great partners and provide the corals with a lot of energy, and some of them are pretty stingy partners and tend more towards the parasitic end of things. And some of them can deal with heat stress pretty well, and some of them cannot. And so one of the main questions that coral reef scientists are trying to understand is, to what extent is the type of symbiont partner that you have responsible for whether or not you can survive heat waves. So heat stress disrupts this intimate symbiosis. So when water warms up, if you start with a healthy coral, water warms up and you get this process that's known as coral bleaching. And what happens is, as the water warms up, the relationship basically becomes toxic. The symbionts start producing toxins. The coral interprets that as something being very problematic, and it kicks out all of its symbionts. And when it does that, that is when a coral looks ghostly white, because it has lost all of its symbionts. So corals at that point aren't dead, but they're sick. It's a sign of them being in real trouble. And they can recover if the water temperature goes back down to normal levels. Then under normal conditions, they are typically able to reabsorb or take up those symbionts if the conditions haven't gone on for too long, and hopefully recover. But if conditions persist for too long, what essentially is happening during that period is the coral is starving to death because it doesn't have its food production source. So if it goes on for too long, and that can be 4 weeks or 8 weeks of heat stress, then corals die. Okay, so that sounds really simple, like we should understand when a coral is going to die and when it's not. But in fact, there's an enormous amount of variability across different reefs and across different species, and even in the same species on the exact same reef, as you see here. So this is a photo that I took on Christmas Island early on in the bleaching event, and these are branched corals, 2 different colonies, but sitting right side by side to each other. And one of them is completely bleached, and the other sitting right beside it, exposed to the exact same conditions, is not bleached. And so this gets at the heart of this question of trying to understand which corals are going to be winners and which corals are going to be losers under climate change, and then can we harness that knowledge and do anything about it? So with this massive El Nino on its way, we mobilized a team, and my idea for understanding this was to put tags on hundreds of corals around this island, track them throughout the event. By taking tissue samples, we can run analyses that identify which types of symbiotic partners they have. And so in doing so, we would be able to understand if the type of partner that you have helps you survive these events, and essentially figure out which ones would be the winners and which ones would be the losers. And so we ended up pulling off this kind of crazy idea, and did so with this enormous team, some of whom I've already shown you, but I want to point out 2 of my former students, Danielle Klaar and Christina Tijen, who really did hundreds of dives to tag what ended up being over 1,000 different corals. You can only do a couple on each dive. So this was really a heroic effort on their parts, tagging them and tracking them and doing that all around the island so that we could also get a handle on, doesn't matter if the reef is really degraded beforehand, or do corals do better on a pristine reef? And these are some of my other colleagues, Kim Cobb, who gave me my initial climate change wake-up call, and a suite of other amazing coral reef biologists who I've had the pleasure of working with over the past decade. So this ended up being, the 2015-2016 El Nino ended up being the biggest El Nino on record. So in the end, it surpassed the 97-98 one. And These were some of the headlines. By October of 2015, NOAA in the United States had declared it to be the 3rd ever global coral bleaching event, and it is the biggest coral bleaching event that has happened to date. Now, within this biggest ever El Nino, Christmas Island was hit the hardest out of anywhere on the entire planet. And so we were really at the heart of this completely unprecedented heat stress, which I'm going to show you now. Okay, so what you're seeing here is the heat stress that unfolded across the world's oceans between the beginning of 2015 and the spring of 2016. And Christmas Island is right here in the center. And what you can see is that the heat stress, shown in red, got on to Christmas Island in about the summer of 2015, and it just got a chokehold there. And the difference that you see from other areas is that other areas, the heat stress came, but then it abated. It came in another place, it abated. But at all of those times as it was moving across the ocean in other areas, it was just sitting, baking the corals on Christmas Island. And in the end, that heat stress lasted for 10 straight months, which is completely unprecedented. So this is another way of depicting this. Coral reef biologists often use this measure called DHW, degree heating wakes, which is just a measure of the accumulated heat stress. And the only point that I want to make here, well, just first I'll say that this is the Northern Line Islands. So this Christmas is part of the Northern Line Islands, and it was hit the hardest of any of them. But the point I want to make is simply that prior to this event, scientists measured this accumulated heat stress in weeks. And it was thought that no coral reef on the entire planet would ever experience 25-degree heating weeks until mid-century. But we did during that time. And so essentially, Christmas broke the chart. And because of this event, scientists are now basically developing new indices and thinking about new ways to measure heat stress, because we're basically in uncharted waters. So to take you back to Christmas and show you how we work, we do not have a massive research vessel, but we work on a small boat that is normally a fishing boat. So this is me and one of my PhD students recording data at the back of the boat, and behind us it's just chock-a-block full with dive tanks and equipment. And then this is the front of the boat, chock-a-block full with students and coolers and lots of equipment and lots of stuff going on. And these are the 2 veterans who very wisely are completely covered. And these are the 2 rookies who are about to get baked in the equatorial sun. So there is a lot of stuff going on underwater, and there's a lot of stuff going on the boat as well. So we're typically diving, and then you have a break before you can do your next dive, and there's usually work to be done during that time. So people are filtering water samples or doing lots of different things. But underwater, this is a typical scene. And I don't know if there are any recreational divers in the group, but recreational diving is such a beautiful and wonderful thing. And scientific diving is quite different, I would say. And one of the differences that you maybe see in this photo is that we end up having, anywhere from 4 to 10 things clipped on us in all different places that are all, all the gear that you're going to need to do the work underwater. And so one of the pieces of gear which Christina is holding here is an underwater drill. So that's another type of equipment that you maybe don't think about when you're recreational diving. This is us working in, I want to say, the lab at night, but the lab is our hotel room that we convert into a makeshift lab each evening to process lots of samples, do water filtering of various kinds, and then kind of collapse in bed right behind us in this photo here before getting up and doing it again. And I just want to show you one other form of sampling that we do that was developed by a friend of mine in Hawaii, where we build 3D models of the coral reef. And so this is my student Kevin taking the images that later were used to develop this model of the coral reef. So we have plots all around the island. These are permanent 4-meter by 4-meter plots, and we've been following them for many years now, and are able to identify every coral, in the plot, look at changes over time in the diversity and the habitat complexity, which is really important for providing homes for different fish. Okay, so I'm going to take you through this major heat wave and show you what we saw. So close to the beginning, this was about 2 months into the event, there was really highly variable bleaching. So some corals were bleached, as you can see here, but lots of corals of the exact same species were only starting to bleach, and many other corals hadn't bleached at all at that point. So fast forward to December, we were not out there in December, but a fishing guide who is also a diver who we had talked to over the years went diving and was horrified by what he saw and sent me these photos. And what you're seeing here in the foreground are all of these bleached corals that look this ghostly white, but it's actually back here that is much more worrying, because behind those ghostly corals are corals that have already bleached and died and then been overgrown by algae. So all of these are dead. And so this was a really shocking sight. Close to the tail end of the event, when we were back out there for our next expedition, after the corals had been under heat stress for 10 straight months, this is what we saw. And this is actually this exact same shot that I showed you on the title slide and another time. This is this very distinctive coral here. And almost everything is dead at this point. These are very large corals. They're acroporids. They're also known as tabletop corals because they are as big as, well, much bigger than even a very massive dining room table. And we know from their size that they were at least 60 or 70 years old. And so that tells us that they had all survived the 97-98 event. But all of them, without exception, perished in this event. And so there was a lot of media attention over the course of this third global coral bleaching event, particularly on the Great Barrier Reef, understandably. But the heat stress on Christmas, as I said, was the worst. And so that also, anything that, you know, is a real extreme attracts the media. And so we, in our March-April trip of 2016, ended up using our satellite phone that we normally have there just in case we have a dive emergency and need to call the US Coast Guard. We were instead using that emergency satellite phone to do interviews with Associated Press and the New York Times and Climate Central and Washington Post and other venues. And so it was a very surreal and sobering expedition for us. So overall, we estimate that 90% of the corals died during this marine heat wave. And this figure looks very simple, and I always kind of grimace when I see it because this figure is the result of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of work. So it is the result of us taking thousands of photos on the reef over the course of many years, starting before the event and then till after the event, coming back to the lab and identifying all of the corals on the coral cover, and then boiling it down to this very simple figure to show this big loss of coral cover over that event. And I'll also just point out that there were, of course, big differences in coral cover around the island before the event because of that gradient of disturbance. So before the event, the most pristine parts of the island had pretty high, so this is very low disturbance, very high coral cover, very low disturbance, had very high coral cover. And the ones that were already had very high local disturbance had already lost a lot of their coral. But the take home from this really is that across the island, most coral was lost, so that there's now between 4 to 6% coral cover anywhere that you go on the island. Okay, so coming back to this slide that I showed you at the beginning, this is how it looked before the event and the exact same area after the event. So what you can see is that there's still a few corals that have survived, but overall really huge losses. At other dive sites, the coral was completely overgrown by this macroalgae, which reminds me of sort of a green shag carpet that many of us had in our basements in the 1970s. That's basically what it looks like. And this is bad news for coral in the sense that not only has the coral been lost, but when the reef gets overgrown in this way, it makes it more difficult for coral to come back because the juveniles can't settle out, the larvae can't settle out on this substrate. So they need a hard, flat substrate to settle out on. So this makes it more difficult for them to recover. I'm just going to skip that and show you just two other projects that students did. So one was a project by my master's student, Dominique Malciari, who was, everything I've shown you so far is about hard coral. And so those are the corals that are building the reef, but there are also beautiful soft corals. And so this is an example of a gorgeous soft coral. And she wanted to look at that and demonstrated that there was almost complete loss of the soft corals. And what we saw there on the island during the heat wave was that those soft corals essentially melted down and kind of ended up looking like melted Velveeta cheese on the coral. And then another master's student, Jen Magel, wanted to look at the impacts of the heat wave on marine reef fish. And what she found was that there were these huge losses of reef fish during the event. So the entire reef fish community plummeted by about half, but then it rebounded the next year. And so essentially what we think happened is that it was too hot for the reef fish on a shallow reef that we tend to survey, and they simply moved deeper into deeper waters and then came back once it was better. Okay, I am wondering about time. I'm thinking maybe I'll just show you a couple more things and then finish with the solutions. I don't know what you think, Joanne, in terms of time.
That sounds good. You definitely have about another 10 minutes or so with questions.
Okay, great. Okay, so I want to give you some glimmers of hope. And I understand that you have to be a really glass half full kind of person to think that 10% survival is cause for optimism. But I wasn't sure that we would see any survival when we got out there at the end of the event. And we did see corals that looked like this at the end, and then the following year had completely recovered, and other corals that looked like this at the end of the event, so actually looked completely healthy at the end of this event, and then the following year had even grown and done even better. I'm just going to maybe tell you our most surprising story. So this is one of our tagged corals, and this type of coral is known as a brain coral, and this is something that we found that was highly unexpected in these brain corals. So this is just to show you this heat wave and how this heat wave unfolded between 2015 and 2016. And each of the arrows is a time that we were out surveying the reef. And this is just one of these tagged corals that we followed through time, but this is a phenomenon that we saw in most of these brain corals. So prior to the event, a healthy coral. Early on in the event, the coral had bleached, which is exactly what you would expect. And then we didn't know what we were going to find 10 months later. But what we found was something that no one has ever observed before in corals. And that is a completely recovered coral while still under heat stress. So this is completely flies in the face of everything that coral reef biologists think they know, which is that when corals bleach, conditions have to go back to normal. So the stress has to abate before that symbiotic relationship can reestablish. What we found is that at least for this species and a couple of others, that doesn't appear to be true. And even when corals are under heavy heat stress, they can actually reestablish symbiosis, but they tend to do that with a different type of symbiotic partner. And we have followed this. This shows you the following year or later that year, but we followed that coral right through to 2019, and it is alive and well, as are most of the brain corals. So this is a really important finding, particularly in light of the fact that under climate change, these marine heat waves are becoming longer and longer. And so if corals are able to reestablish their symbiosis and be fed again while they're still in a marine heat wave, it suggests that we have some pause for optimism that some of them will be able to survive these heat waves. So I'm not going to delve into the details of this figure, but what I guess what I want to, well, maybe I will a little bit, but just to make a quick point, which I think is really important. So these are the different sites around the island for which we had data on these brain corals, where we had tagged brain corals and we followed them over time. And we looked at the type of symbiotic partner that they had before the event. And the only thing that I want you to see here is that all of the symbiotic partners at the sites that were really highly disturbed, so very close to the villages, they all had one type of symbiotic partner. And the brain corals, pretty much anywhere else on the island, tended to have different types of symbiotic partners. And that ended up being really, really important, because all of the brain corals that were at the very highly disturbed sites died, and brain corals that were at any other level of disturbance, so it didn't have to be the most pristine site, even if it had a bit of local disturbance, they survived. And so this is a really important finding, in the sense that it tells us that, at least for some corals, managing local stressors is actually really important and can give them a greater chance of surviving these marine heat waves. And that sounds very, very obvious probably, but it's actually been highly contentious and heavily debated in the scientific world. And so this was pretty clear evidence that, at least in this case, local management matters. Okay, but in the face of all that devastation, what do we really do about it? We know, for example, so this is from the latest IPCC report, and this is just showing how big a threat climate change poses to coral reefs, which are shown over here on the left. So the darker intensity colors are worse, and this is how bad it will be as we go up to 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, or all the way up to 4 degrees warming. And this is showing a number of different ocean ecosystems, kelp forests like we have here, salt marshes, and just showing that coral reefs are the most vulnerable ocean ecosystems. And the latest estimates are that once we get to 1.5 degrees warming, we will have lost somewhere between 70 and 90% of coral reefs. And if we allow warming to go all the way to 2 degrees, we will lose virtually all coral reefs. So it's this particular point that is sort of really the driving motivation, or one of my major driving motivations for everything that I'm doing now, attempting to find climate solutions. And so a lot of people in the coral reef world are working on the science to try to basically manipulate corals and make them more tolerant to heat stress. But about a year ago, I kind of had I don't know if it was an epiphany or more just a sinking feeling that couldn't get any lower, and realized, that's not how we're going to save corals. And so over the past year, I've really been reevaluating what I do and where I put my energy, and thinking a lot about broader climate actions, and the fact that we here in Canada have a much bigger role to play in saving corals than coral scientists actually do. And that's because the key to saving corals isn't manipulating corals, it's reducing greenhouse gas emissions and getting off our fossil fuel addiction. So this is one of the signs at COP26 that was in the lineup as we were walking in, and the urgency was palpable. So I went to COP26. It was the first time I had been on a plane or even left Vancouver Island in almost 2 years because of COVID. And it was an extraordinary and quite intense experience. And I'm happy to talk about that more. But I just want to finish with a couple of points about Canada. And the first is to say that we are huge contributors to the climate change problem. And so what you're seeing here is differences in per capita emissions, and there's no way you can read all of those, but each one of these little colors is a different country on the planet. And the bigger the bar here, the higher the per capita greenhouse gas emissions. And Canada is up here, just pointing out that we're near the top. We're one of the highest greenhouse gas emitters per capita on the planet. So we often hear Canadians who don't want to work on climate change or don't think that we should be doing anything say, why should we do anything? This is all up to India and China. it's not on us to do this. We're a small country. We're a small country with a big problem. We're a small country creating a big problem because of our per capita greenhouse gas emissions. And so I personally think that we need to be leaders and be leading the way towards solutions here. Thus far, we have not managed to do that. This is an international group called Climate Action Tracker that assesses how well each country is doing on its climate action. And the punchline here is that Canada is still assessed as being highly insufficient. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. And I think that that's because our governments have been really wonderful about making plans and making promises and then breaking those promises. And so the key here, and particularly in this year, it's a really fundamentally important year for Canadian climate action. We need to be holding our politicians, holding our governments' feet to the fire and making sure that they actually follow through on the things that they've promised. And I have reason to believe that they actually are going to this time. This is our Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. So this is the current federal plan on how we are going to address climate change. But one of the things that gives me hope is that the need to do this is now enshrined in law. And that was never the case before. So as of last June, we have a Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. This is federally legislated that we have to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And importantly, we're now into March, and the end of this month is the deadline for our federal government to produce its first emissions reduction plan. So Environment and Climate Change Canada is leading the charge on this. What I'm showing you here is a report that was released this morning on how we might get there, on how we might do that. So that this is not the government's plan, but this is a climate change think tank in Ottawa called the Canadian Climate Institute. You might have heard of it. It used to be called the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. They just changed their name a week or two ago. I would, if you're interested in this type of policy or how we're going to implement policy, urge you to take a look at that website, Canadian Climate Institute, because they are producing very well thought out comprehensive reports on all of the different actions that we need to be taken. And then I also want to come back to cities and point out that it's not just our federal government that needs to be doing something. It's federal action, it's provincial action, and it's municipal action. And in Canada, there is something called LC3, which stands for Low Carbon Cities in Canada. And it is a group of about 6 or 7 cities, and Toronto is one of them. And they are working specifically on what cities need to be doing to get to net zero emissions, because they understand that a lot of our emissions have to do with policy that is actually at the city level, so the municipal level. So we need to have change at all levels. Okay. If you are interested in learning more, I'll also just show you, and I'm going to share these slides as well, so I can, I will share these slides with Joanne and Karen, and they can send them out. But there's been just a slew of books put out in the past couple of years, and this is just a small sampling of them. One of the ones that I think is really great is Katharine Hayhoe's book, Saving Us, which is a hopeful case about climate change. And Katharine Hayhoe is a Canadian climate scientist who is a marvelous science communicator. And would really encourage you to take a look at her book and her work. And if you're more into podcasts than reading, these are just 2 of the many climate podcasts. So you can get this on iTunes or Spotify or pretty much anywhere. I really like How to Save a Planet because it's really solutions focused. And so, yeah, it's a fun one to have a listen to. And again, I'll share all of this, so you don't need to be worrying about, writing everything down. Okay, and then I'm just going to finish with the action of the day. And so I had a really hard time thinking of the action of the day because I feel like I want you to do everything, but that's why climate change is so overwhelming, right? And so just think about one thing that we can be doing this week in particular is to take a look at the new IPCC report. Now, it is a massive report. Almost 4,000 pages long. So I'm not suggesting you read that. What I'm suggesting you do is go to the website, which if you just Google IPCC it probably actually will come up as the first thing, but it's the 6th assessment report. And there are great summaries there. You can read just the press release, which is 2 pages, the headline statement, which is 3 pages. And I also noticed that if you go to the website and scroll down, there's something called frequently asked questions. This is one of the answers. So this is the first frequently asked questions was what's new, which I think is a great question because most people feel like it's just the same old, like everything's bad. It's been bad for a long time. Why do I need another report to tell me how bad it is? So this points out what's new. Or, and I thought this might be interesting for this group, there's also at the bottom of the first page something called fact sheets. And if you go into the fact sheets, there's one specifically on biodiversity that might be of interest to this group. And then there's a few videos that I think are just, 2 to 3 minute trailers, like a movie of the IPCC report. So lots of ways just in 15 to 20 minutes to get some information about the latest report and understand the urgency that is conveyed in this latest report. But I don't want you to stop there. The really important point is to start a conversation with someone outside of this group, that doesn't count, someone, a family member, a neighbor, someone, in the grocery store, next time you're in a cab with a taxi driver, with anyone about this report and why it's so important that Canada starts following through on its climate action promises. I truly believe that talking about climate change is, first of all, something that we don't do very often. And so it's so wonderful to see this group and a group of people who are engaged in learning more about it. But we need to spread that knowledge beyond the choir so that we're not just preaching to the choir, because this is an everything issue. It's not an environmental issue. It's an everything issue. And everyone needs to know that, and everyone needs to care, and everyone needs to push their government, whether it's municipal, provincial, or federal, towards solving this problem. And we need to start doing that right now. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Julia. Thank you so much. Are you ready for a few questions?
Yeah, for sure.
There's lots in there about what an absolutely terrific presentation that was. And your slides are amazing. And I really, really thought the way you covered action was incredible. You've also listed some of my favorite books. Catherine Hayhoe is my heroine of all the writers. She's quite amazing.
Yes, I was wondering, I almost wanted a show of hands of how many people know Catherine Hayhoe, because she writes climate change articles for Chatelaine magazine quite often, for Maclean's, in the Globe and Mail. She's a fantastic communicator. I can't say enough good things about her. I think she's so wonderful.
The comments keep coming in about what a fantastic presentation, Julia, that you gave. I'm going to
thank you.
I will do a couple questions. I'm starting at the bottom here. Liz says, we keep, whoops, my chat disappeared on me. Sorry. We keep hearing that the federal government's now legally accountable for reaching its emissions reduction goals. What happens if they don't meet its targets? Good question.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I'm going to give you my opinion, but I am not a policy expert, so I can't give you the legal. I'm probably not going to give you the official answer, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I think on the one hand, maybe it's easy to say, well, nothing will happen, but and maybe I'm being naive, or maybe I'm just being like willfully optimistic, which I am, because I need to be to get up out of bed in the morning and move on. But I think they're going to. And the reason that I think they're going to, well, first of all, if they don't meet them, we could vote them out. But also, then what's our alternative in Canada, right? I do think they're going to. And the reason is, speaking with policy experts who know much more about this than I do, the sentiment with all of the cabinet changes that happened after the last federal election in the fall was that the previous cabinet was the getting things set up cabinet, and that this cabinet is the getting things done cabinet, specifically on climate change. And there's definitely a feeling in Ottawa that, although this might be a laughable thing to say right now, but that it is Trudeau's desire that his legacy be climate action. So he's certainly not there yet. He better not quit anytime soon if he wants that to be his legacy. But I think there were some key things that happened that are key indicators that this is the get things done cabinet. and specifically moving Jonathan Wilkinson from ECCC over to NRC. He is pretty widely regarded as the only politician or the only liberal minister who will be able to take on the oil and gas industry. And so he was, when they first did that, I thought, why did they do that? He was so great at ECCC, but that was very strategic with that in mind. And then strategically putting Stephen Guilbeault in as the Minister of ECCC, also a very, very strategic move. He is deeply committed to this. This is, sometimes we get random people. I've watched over several decades us just having random fisheries ministers, which is the ministry that I've interacted with a lot of times in the past, and it's just a disaster. But Stephen Guilbeault, as the Minister of ECCC, is the perfect person at the perfect time. And I watched him and Wilkinson at COP for a week, and they had very prominent positions there, and they were running around from dawn to dusk. I don't want to say like chickens with their head cut off, because that sounds not strategic, but they were busy. They were very, very busy. Let me say that. And I think they're the two right people that we need. And those are two of the key ministries. Of course, we need every ministry pulling together. We need an all of government approach. So I think it's getting the other ministries on board. But I think that we're finally there. A government who doesn't intend to do anything doesn't enshrine it in law that they're going to do something. I mean, they didn't have to do that. So, I feel optimistic, but I also think it's up to us to hold their feet to the fire. And ways that we can hold their feet to the fire are communicating with them, right? And so I think lots of communications. I think I would love to see a letter from your group going to them, or writing an op-ed for the Hill Times, which is the Ottawa online newspaper. That's what they read. And so a letter from your group about the importance of climate action right now, I think would be really powerful. I think that we need pressure from everyone, which is why I come back to saying that we need to be talking about this. And it's so easy right now to be distracted by the pandemic, by the war in the Ukraine, which of course we need to be focusing on, and is obviously deserving of our attention right now for so many reasons. But we also need to keep coming back to climate change, because climate change is linked to all of these things, really.
Thank you. You've got it. We're on it for sure. Letters are going.
Just to plant the seed of you have power. Wield it.
Liz says that she loves your sweatshirt, by the way.
Thank you. So this is I didn't make up this term, but my partner definitely. I'm known as a climate optimist, and he definitely thinks the word stubborn should be before it in my case. But Cristiana Figueres came up with this team. She is a Costa Rican diplomat and the architect of the Paris Agreement. And she calls herself a stubborn climate optimist. And I just love that, because I've gotten slapped on the wrists before for being too optimistic, and people saying like, well, don't be too optimistic when you tell them about it. And I personally think that we need optimism, and optimism isn't idealism, and it isn't being a Pollyanna. But for me, optimism is needed, because this is a marathon, not a sprint. And I simply can't marathon under the guise of pessimism, which is where I dwelled for several decades. I've done the pessimism thing for decades, and it didn't end super well. And I feel there's a real need for optimism to give us motivation to do something.
I'm going to take this opportunity to thank Julia for this really fabulous and informative presentation. You've certainly conveyed the necessity of acting right now, and really holding our politicians accountable, and we will do that. So thank you, Julia. It was so informative and really, really great for raising our awareness. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joanne.
Okay, so at this point, I want to thank Joanne and the NBS group for a wonderful presentation that they've organized, and for bringing Julia to us. So thank you. And I also want to thank Carolyn Caroline Taylor, Karen Robbins, Karen Sadlier Brown. These individuals were all part of the production team today. And while this looks like a pretty simple event, there's a lot of work behind it. And I want to thank those individuals as well. So we have a lot of upcoming events. These are all listed in our newsletter. And Julie, I think you'll be very proud of us. We're working on all fronts. So we have the nature-based solution groups. These are interest groups that meet monthly. And I really encourage people who are not part of an interest group, but might be interested to come and check them out. You don't have to make a commitment. You can drop in and take a look and then make a decision. We also have an individual action interest group that meets monthly. Karen Robbins and Caroline Taylor are the co-leads on that. And that group focuses on looking what we as individuals can do. There's a leadership team. There's a leadership team that meets monthly right now on Zoom. And we have a climate advocacy group, just what we've been talking about, the importance of connecting with other groups and advocating politically, although nonpartisan. And there's a special meeting coming up this Wednesday, March the 16th at 2:00. And they're going to, in the March 16th meeting, they're going to have a couple of experts looking at district energy as a key way of heating buildings without gas. So I think that'll be a really interesting meeting. And our next monthly learning meeting will be Wednesday, April the 6th, which is at our regular time at 10:00 on Zoom. And it's going to be by the Advocacy Interest Group, and it's going to be preparing for the Ontario election. And if you have any questions at all, there's our new email address, contact.us@climatelearners.ca. So please reach out, and we'll be happy to answer any questions or any concerns. Can I have the next slide, Caroline, which is actually my favorite? So you're invited to stay. We always have an informal chat at the end of the formal meeting. And so you can stay on and we'll just talk informally. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And we'll look forward to further conversation.
You had a chart that showed the amount of loss that had occurred in the pristine to the more disturbed areas.
Mm-hmm.
And right across the bottom, it was all basically the same amount. So you'd had basically 90% die back in the pristine, but only about 30% die back. What were the species? And if I missed you saying that, what were the species that survived other than the brain coral?
So great question. I didn't get into that in the interest of time because it was taking too long, but
oh, that's okay. It was wonderful.
You've asked exactly the right question, which is that some corals did pretty well and some corals, all of them died. So there's just this huge differences. And so the ones that did the best, the brain coral was one of the ones that did the best. Another one that did really well is called, I don't know if you know corals, but another one that did really well is called Porites. So the ones that tended to do well were sort of mounding corals.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the branched corals perished. Most of the big tabular corals perished. So like all of the Acropora died, almost all of the Montipora died. So those, we had some that had 99%, and then Porites, on the other hand, 50% of them survived. And that's one of the questions we're digging into right now, because that's so strange, right? Why 50%? Why were 50% vulnerable and the other 50% not vulnerable? So that's something that we're looking into right now. And there's some intriguing clues so far that it has to do with cryptic diversity, so that what we think is a single species of Porites is actually, there's finer scale genetic differences, and some of the lineages had really high survival, and another one that had a different type of symbiotic partner seemed really vulnerable. So I think there's a lot of cryptic diversity amongst corals. Like, it's very hard to tell coral species, to identify them just by looking at them down to the species level. And even if you think you're doing that, often there's subspecies and a lot of different diversity under the hood, basically.
Okay. And does that have any, what survived, is that rich with encouraging biodiversity, or are they less encouraging diversity?
Yeah, also a great question. So the ones that survived well are possibly not the best, because they don't form these big complex structures. They tend to be like circular rocks or just kind of mounding, whereas the branching ones and tabular ones perished. But one of the things that's interesting that we found that is a little bit counterintuitive is that there are juveniles on the reef about this big, that are, a lot of them are the Acropora corals, where the adults all perished. And so what we think happened is that there was a recruitment event right before the heat wave. All of those baby acroporids recruited in. I kind of think of it as like they were born in the hood. They were just born in bad conditions and they were okay with it. And they've persisted and they're fine. And so there are actually more juvenile acroporids on the reef than there are juvenile brain corals or juvenile Porites. And so we sort of have this mismatch that isn't even, is a little counterintuitive. But the other thing is that some of the species that did poorly, they'll come back quickly because they have really fast growth rates. So some of those branching corals have very fast growth rates, and we expect that they'll start to come back much faster than the brain coral will grow, because it has a very slow growth rate. So there's definitely going to be a mix up of, what is left on the reef and what the reef that comes back will look like. It'll have different species, but it's also a little bit hard to predict because of all these different factors going on.
Thank you very much, and keep being stubborn.
Thanks, I will.
It's amazing to see how incredibly complicated the corals are. Thank you so much. And it's Karen.
So I didn't hear that. How incredibly what? Oh, hi.
How incredibly complex corals are, and how incredibly interesting. And you were in a movie, not a documentary that people can see on Netflix that is stunning, which is the one I did see was Chasing Corals, and I know you were in another one as well. It's on.
Yeah, so probably lots of people have seen Chasing Corals. I have a 2-second cameo in Chasing Corals, so you can play the game of seeing if you can find it. And then I was also in a documentary called Reef Rescue, which was shown in Canada on the nature of things, and so is available online on CBC Gem.
Thank you.
So my question sort of follows after Janet's, which is, are there any particular things that you can do to sort of either reinvigorate or protect the corals so that, we could hopefully keep them alive as much as possible and have this diversity of corals?
Right. I'm going to say the number one thing that is, my party line right now, which is reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So what's happening on reefs and what we can be doing on reefs is reducing local pressures. And I think the primary thing for corals is improving water quality because they're quite sensitive to that. There's a lot of restoration effort going on. There's a lot of work in laboratories trying to increase the thermal tolerance of corals. And that's having, I would say, not only is that only having mixed results, but there's also, it hasn't been scaled anywhere, right? So I hesitate to say we shouldn't be doing that. I think we're in a, it's a triage situation for corals right now. And so we should be trying everything that we can try. But I think it would be a mistake to think that that's going to fix corals. It's not. That's not going to save corals. Like, the only thing that is going to save corals is limiting global warming.
Okay, thank you.
Which is why we have a role to play, which I love, right? It's, because Canadians usually are like, well, how am I going to save coral reefs? And it's like, well, actually, you have a really fundamentally important role to play in doing that.
Okay, thank you.
Any others?
Yeah,
I had a question.
Oh, okay.
Liz?
Okay, just quickly. I think a lot of us have seen Sir David Attenborough's documentaries about the Great Coral Reef and its death, and are devastated by those images. And I'm wondering if you think there's any hope at all that that could be brought back to life. I mean, is dead coral, or can it actually be resurrected in some way?
Yeah, I think that coral reefs have a remarkable capacity to recover when they're given a chance. And so the Great Barrier Reef is not all dead, first of all. There's a huge amount of variability in how much bleaching there was and how much mortality, especially moving from the north to the south. And even individual coral colonies have a remarkable capacity to recover. So we saw so many coral colonies where at the end of the event, there was one tiny, tiny little patch that was still alive, and everything else on it was dead. And then, some of them, that was too much. They were on their way out, and others, started to grow back. And it's actually referred to as the phoenix effects of coral reefs, because these coral colonies that are seemingly dead, even if they have a few alive corallites, they can come back, right? And, they have remarkable capacities to come back that way. So for individual coral colonies to recover, for new recruitment, growth of new corals. But I think the concern is that if we don't limit warming, every reef on the planet will be hit with marine heat waves at a more regular interval than the time it takes to recover, right? But given a bit, I want to say there's hope, because we do need to turn things around after we get to 1.5. But there's lots of options on the table right now. That's wide open what we do right now, and that's going to directly dictate how many corals we end up having, amongst many other things, amongst everything else that it's going to dictate.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say Linda's got her hand up patiently there.
That's what I was going to say. Linda's been waiting. Yeah.
Okay. I was just going to ask if we know when the next El Nino event is scheduled.
Oh my God, you would really think I would know the answer to that, and I actually don't. And the reason that I don't is because of COVID, which is that we haven't been able to go to Christmas for the past 3 years, and we're planning an expedition for this year that has now been canceled as well because of COVID. Which is all that to say that I used to monitor these things weekly, and now don't, because now I'm focused on things closer to home. But typically every seven-ish years, not to say that every 7 years is a really bad one though, but yeah.
Okay.
So we're coming due, basically.
Yeah. I think Peggy is next. Go ahead, Peggy.
Yes, Julia, I just want two fast things. Is there a relationship between El Nino and climate change? I wasn't clear if you had said that there was. And my second question is, I think you might have mentioned something about disruption of the coral reefs contributing to their disintegration. I didn't know what you meant by disruption. Are you talking like issues around tourism and that kind of thing as well? So those are my two questions.
I'm not quite sure what I was saying on the second, but on the first, yes, there is evidence that climate change, so El Ninos are a natural oceanographic phenomena, but there is evidence that climate change is amplifying them and making them more frequent as well.
Okay.
So
you didn't say
anything basically supercharges them. I don't know what I was saying.
Maybe I heard you wrong. I thought you'd said something.
No, you probably didn't. I just said a lot.
Okay, is there any, just off the top, is there any relationship between sort of disruption, and I'm thinking, tourism, disruption of coral, disruption, that's what I meant.
Yeah, right, absolutely. So even without climate change, we have already done lots of things to corals. And part of that is, if you want to call it local disturbance or local disruption, but lots of coastal resorts are built. You know, we all like to go to Club Med in the tropics, and those are often built near coral reefs, and oftentimes coral reefs are getting dredged, essentially bulldozed, to make way for coastal development. There's so many forms of local disruption. So yeah, I always think about climate change as being superimposed on all of the other things underneath that we do locally to damage coral reefs.
Thank you.
I think Gary and then Michael Berger.
Julia, I don't know if this is too specific, but in the 90s, I was in Costa Rica, and they advised us to buy organic bananas because the runoff from non-organic banana plantations was killing reefs like mad. I don't know if that still remains true or not, and wondered if you had an opinion.
So I haven't heard that specifically, but definitely coral reefs are really sensitive to any pollution in the water. So I would imagine that that's chemical inputs and not going to be good for them. You know, more common ones are sewage outflow or agricultural outflow that's more so eutrophying the water or polluting it in other ways. But I think a lot of times on coral reefs, what we focus on is overfishing. But for the corals themselves, I think it's water quality. To my mind, that's the primary thing. So I would say that was good advice.
And a follow-up would be, I noticed you talking about the pros covering up entirely in the sun there. And I've heard that sunscreen is really bad for coral.
Yeah, so yeah, there definitely has been a lot about that. You know, it's not clear to me how serious a threat it poses, but it definitely got a lot of attention a couple of years ago. So I don't think I can give you a definitive answer.
Okay.
I'm sure it's not fantastic, but there are types that are meant to be safer. But I think it's such a you know, minor threat compared to the bigger ones that we're dealing with.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, but we do wear the, you know, the type that's supposed to be better now, which is the mineral-based stuff that just your entire face just, you know, is white, like it doesn't rub in, basically.
Okay, Julia, you mentioned that about 25% of fish are, the coral is important, about 25% of the fish. So I'm wondering if once the coral is bleached, whether that 25% drops to zero or where on a gradient that is, if you follow the question.
So just to clarify, that 25% of the ocean biodiversity is associated with coral reefs. And so if we lose the coral reefs, what will happen to that biodiversity? Is that the question? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer, but it's something that I think about a lot. I don't think, I haven't actually seen an estimate of how much biodiversity would be lost. I would certainly imagine a lot, but there's also a lot of active restoration going on, what is called reef restoration, where they're actually building artificial reefs that the basis of them is not live coral, and fish tend to do fairly well on them. So I think in part because of that, I've never seen a statistic on that. I imagine myself that the loss is going to be catastrophic in the thousands of species, but I hesitate to give you a number. I have a hard time envisioning that we're going to build artificial reefs in every part of the world and that we're going to somehow maintain them and they're going to be big enough and strong enough and, you know, to actually replace living reefs.
Thank you. I'm not sure, I wasn't talking about artificial reefs. I was talking about the
No, I know.
Oh, you got into that, okay.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And hope.
All right, thanks a lot. That was thanks so much for your interest and sticking it out for so long.